Hi, how are y'all? I'm late. I'm sorry that I am late in getting this video up, so I apologize. It's just been a little bit of a crazy week. So I am coming to you from my living room. I wanted you to meet Kitty. This is her name. Her name is Kitty. She likes to make appearances sometimes, but most of the time in class she ignores me. Decker, my dog, is over here too. You want to meet him? Come here, Decker. Come here, baby. He's been bugging me all day, and now, of course, he's shy. Come here, baby. Oh, he had a little bit of a surgery on his tail, so he has to wear the cone of shame. But he's doing okay. Um, so wanted to talk about the readings this week, which I really appreciated. Because I think they highlight the idea of, so our guiding question, right, is whose voice. What are you eating? Don't eat that. She's eating. We're doing a puzzle, and she likes to eat the puzzle pieces. Sorry, whose voice is heard, and how identity plays a role in your retention or your persistence, and just basically honoring the identity piece that we all bring to the table. Particularly, and I'm excited that we're going to get to hear from Dr. Gildersleeve this week, just because, I think this was an interesting look at some of his research in terms of thinking about, and I don't know if you all have been at institutions, or if your institution, I don't even know if DU does this, but does a Latinx graduation or a multicultural graduation or something like that. But I thought this was such a really lovely look at this, but B, in kind of balancing it with student activism and thinking about how the ways in which students are empowered or not to make their voices heard, make their identities clear, make their give themselves a space on campus, and they make themselves a space on campus. And this is one way which this group of students does that. And so I loved how it speaks about the centralizing of family. And I kept thinking about what Dr. Nelson was talking about last week about patriarchy and settler colonialism and the role that plays in higher education. And I thought it was so evident here in terms of that creating space within a space that you're given. So the student union is this space, right? But whose space is it? Who gets to control that space? Who gets to own that space? And they made that space into their own for this celebration, and their families were a part of it, and they were connecting the history of, they said that, the Aztec dancers and things like that. So connecting and allowing students to actually use their voice as they stepped across the stage to talk about whatever they wanted to. So it was an interesting thought of, and I like how it connected the neoliberalism, the constant and ever-present neoliberalism that is in higher ed, to what these students were doing and how they had to balance the two. But really the process of gave me pause to think about, how am I in my work? How am I ensuring that my students have the space and the place to infuse their voice into their higher ed experience, and always making sure that their voice is honored. Which leads me into the second article, which was the Manzano, Poon, and Na article on the Asian American student engagement. And this was an interesting take because it was talking about kind of two different ways that students engage, and then really taking on the lens of, and it was specific Asian American identity, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but really talking about student involvement and engagement, Aston's model. So if you read the supplemental article, it's Aston speaking about the student involvement and engagement theory of higher ed. And this was specifically speaking about student leadership in terms of and using Wren's kind of idea of, if you haven't read Chris Wren's work, I really admire the work that she does. But talking about student leadership, and I always think about it as kind of working within the system to create small incremental changes. That's incremental leadership. But working within a system and having some positional leadership in there so that you have more of a voice possibly. And then comparing that to student activism, which is more, I would say, looking at things from a critical lens of wanting to change a system rather than possibly just the student experience within a system, but change a system, and going about that from maybe the outside, maybe going around some of the things, whereas student leadership might want to make small incremental changes within a system. This one is, when I think of student activism, it's kind of looking at wanting to break down the system in general. Just my point of view. But I want to talk about the Asian American identity, the lens, and I loved this. I'm so not technical the way Dr. Nelson's so good at this, but like this figure in the reading of everything is looking through this Asian American identity, this lens, this film of the Asian American identity, and recognizing that students who are going into whatever, whether it's positional leadership, doing incremental change, or this transformational change, looking at the whole system broadly, what is their identity? Because the Asian American and Asian identities there's so much variation and diversity within that assuming that there's one Asian American perspective is a mistake that I think a lot of people make, that I know a lot of people make. And I think that's one that has been newly really relevant to me, of knowing who my students are, knowing the identities that they're coming to us with, and knowing that as Asian Americans or Asian students, those identities, where they're coming from can be very different from one another, and then very different from the dominant culture that they're trying to work within or against, or both. So that I thought was very interesting. I loved the diagrams in this article. I thought it was really great, a really good way to visually see what they were talking about. And the recommendations for practitioners I thought were very good. Yeah, I mean, and you can look at those and be like, yeah, of course I'm going to empower my students. But I think what it's asking you to do is empower your students for who they are and what they bring, and not just your perspective working within that dominant culture. Because sometimes when we're within it, no matter our identity, we may bring with it that dominant point of view from our identity, as I do as a white straightish woman, in a middle class perspective. But I think really looking at it from our system and the system we work within. And then I just quickly want to talk about those chapter 8 and 9 which is basically kind of the end of, not the end of it, because there's some really good, actually the appendices are interesting, in the book. And I kept thinking about, they're talking about dismantling those pathways in chapter 9, and really what can be done to look at and dismantle and kind of help students find pathways that would help with upward mobility, because chapter 8 is talking about how it doesn't work, right? How those college pathways and post-college prospects, for many of the women that were part of this study, their college experience at MU was not the upward trajectory that a lot of people come to college hoping and thinking that it will be. And then the next chapter 9, is talking about how do you combat that? Because we're not getting rid of large flagship institutions anytime soon, and not to say that all of them are bad, but really, how do we help students move against some of the pathways that aren't as helpful for helping them move forward and move towards pathways that are, and giving them support and finding those students and letting them know what is available to them. Because I still go back to that creaming process of how you find a few students are kind of found and plucked. And that doesn't make sense because so many students will fall through the cracks that way. And so I just think thinking about that, I thought it was an interesting two chapters to end with. But I can't help, and I think this is because of my own perspective, so I'll own my own positionality on this, but the emphasis, and I would say overemphasis, on marriage as a way for upward mobility. And granted, this is 2004, which in my head feels like yesterday, but the constant going back with these women are hoping for marriages. These women, they can increase their upward mobility through marriage. And I'm just like, seriously, we're still there, which brings me back to the settler colonialism that Dr. Nelson left us with last week, where she was talking about, you meet, you marry, land comes with that, status comes with that, and if we're still so fixed on this as our ways of upward mobility for women, I just think we're further behind than we thought we were. And maybe this is coming from me as a 44-year-old woman who is not married. Anywho, I will stop blabbing. I thank you so much for making your way all the way through this. Thanks for still sticking with me, and I'll see you in class. Bye.